On a sunny afternoon, an 8-year-old girl walked peacefully when she saw her 7-year-old friend collapse unconscious on the sidewalk. Without hesitation, she carried him in her arms for several blocks to the hospital, racing against time to save him. In the hospital corridors, shouting, "Help, a doctor, please!" she faced suspicious and prejudiced looks from the medical staff, who assumed she had caused the injuries of the well-dressed boy. She didn't know she was saving the son of a powerful millionaire. The next day, 4 luxury cars parked at the door of her humble home. The Tuesday afternoon sun cast a drowsy heat over the cracked sidewalks of Lena's neighborhood, a heat that made the air shimmer and the scent of warm asphalt rise to her nostrils. At 8 years old, she knew every crack and patch of that path, which she walked every day returning from public school. Her backpack, mended with a scrap of floral fabric by her mom, was heavy on her small shoulders, but it was a familiar weight, a constant companion on her solitary journey. Across the street, at a newer, well-kept bus stop, stood Arthur. He was 7, sporting a pristine uniform from a private school Lena only ever saw in glossy brochures. Over the past 2 weeks, they'd developed a quiet routine, a wave, then a shy smile, and finally, short conversations shouted across the street about warrior ants and clouds that looked like sheep. To Lena, he wasn't a rich kid. He was just Arthur, the friend from across the street. That afternoon, something was different. Arthur didn't wave. He stood swaying slightly, his face as pale as the paper he used for drawing. Lena frowned, tightening her backpack straps. "Are you okay?" she yelled, her voice sounding small in the quiet street. He tried to respond, his lips moving soundlessly, his eyes, usually bright and full of mischief, met hers for an instant, a silent, terrified plea for help. And then, without warning, his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the sidewalk with a dull, final thud, like a rag doll whose strings had been cut. Lena's world stopped. The buzz of cicadas, the distant hum of cars, everything vanished. There was only the boy, motionless on the ground. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but something stronger pushed it down. A fierce instinct, a silent command from a deep place within her. She didn't think, she just acted. She sprinted across the street, her worn shoes slapping against the asphalt. She knelt beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Arthur!" she called, her voice trembling. She shook his shoulder gently. No response. The pallor of his face now had a bluish tint around his lips. A primal fear, the kind children feel in the dark, enveloped her. But the image of her mother, telling her to always be brave and help those in need, flashed in her mind. She looked both ways. The street was deserted. His bus must have already passed. Hers was still a while away. There was no one to ask for help. She was on her own. With an effort that made her muscles scream, she slid her arms beneath him. He was heavier than he looked, a dead, awkward weight. His head lolled back, and for one terrifying moment, she thought she'd hurt him further. Tears of frustration and fear welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. This wasn't the time to cry. With a low groan, she got to her feet, swaying under his weight. Her knees trembled. The local hospital was several blocks away, a walk she sometimes took with her mum and which always felt endless. Carrying Arthur, it felt like a journey to the other side of the world, but she took the first step and then the second. The expensive fabric of his uniform brushed against her simple, faded dress. The scent of his fabric softener, so different from the bar soap her mom used, filled her nostrils. She was just a poor girl, carrying a boy who seemed to belong to another universe, a world of manicured lawns and brand new toys. But in that moment, none of that mattered. He was her friend, and he needed her. With each painful step, the hospital seemed to grow more distant, and a chilling fear she'd never known began to seep into her heart. A fear that had nothing to do with the weight in her arms, but with the terrifying silence of his breathing. The hospital's automatic glass doors hissed open, swallowing Lena and the unbearable weight in her arms into a world of blinding whiteness and sterile, cold air. The contrast with the street's suffocating heat was a shock, making her shiver. The smell of harsh cleaners and something vaguely medicinal filled her lungs, a scent she associated with hushed whispers and worry. Her arms felt like they were on fire, her muscles protesting with every second. Her legs, which had carried her an impossible distance, had turned to jelly. She took a few more stumbling steps to the reception desk, her vision blurred by exhaustion and sweat stinging her eyes. "Help!" she gasped, the words scratching at her dry throat. "Please, help my friend." A woman in a crisp white uniform with a severe expression looked up from a computer, her professional smile vanishing instantly at the sight. Her gaze swept over Lena, lingering on her dusty shoes, her faded dress, and her face streaked with grime and dried tears. Then her eyes landed on Arthur, his expensive uniform and leather shoes, and the woman's expression hardened, transforming into a mask of cold suspicion. "What happened to him?" the woman asked, her voice devoid of warmth, sharp as a shard of glass. It wasn't a question of concern, but an accusation. Lena felt her heart shrivel. The courage that had propelled her through the streets evaporated, replaced by the old, familiar insecurity that haunted her whenever she was near people like that. People who seemed to belong to a world where everything was clean, orderly, and expensive. He fell, Lena stammered. "He passed out on the street. I brought him here." The woman raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. "You brought him? Alone?" The disbelief in her voice made Lena feel even smaller, as if she'd done something wrong. Other staff members began to approach, drawn by the unusual scene. In seconds, a doctor and 2 nurses were by her side, but their eyes showed no compassion for her. They roughly and efficiently took Arthur from her arms, placing him on a gurney that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Lena instinctively reached out, a whimper of protest escaping her lips, but they were already wheeling him toward a set of double doors. "Wait!" she cried, her voice failing her. The doctor paused for a second, turning to her impatiently. "What's his name? Do you know his family?" "It's Arthur. I don't know his last name," Lena replied, a knot forming in her throat. "We're friends." The doctor exchanged a meaningful glance with one of the nurses, a look that said everything. To them, her story made no sense. A girl like her, friends with a boy like him. The older nurse, with a tight bun and an icy gaze, approached Lena. "You'll have to wait here and answer some questions. Where did you find him? Was anyone else there? Did you push him?" The last question hit Lena like a punch to the gut. The injustice of the accusation stole her breath. She, who had mustered every ounce of her strength to save him, was now seen as the culprit. The tears she'd held back so fiercely finally came, hot and bitter, streaming down her exhausted face. The nurse sighed, a sound of pure irritation. "Look, kid, we don't have time for sniveling. Just tell us the truth." She grabbed Lena's arm, her hand firm and cold, trying to steer her toward a plastic chair in a corner. "You'll stay here until security arrives." But Lena dug her heels in, a desperate loyalty to Arthur overcoming her fear. She couldn't leave him, not while they thought she was the villain. The nurse tightened her grip, her patience clearly exhausted. "Don't make things harder on yourself," she said, her voice low and threatening. The vice-like grip on Lena's arm was overwhelming, as was the feeling of powerlessness. She was cornered, surrounded by impassive faces that had already judged and condemned her. Security would arrive, and what would they do? Call her parents, who already worked so hard just to keep a roof over their heads. Her mom would be devastated to hear her daughter was being treated like a delinquent. The thought sent a new wave of panic through her body. She opened her mouth to try and explain herself once more, to beg them to believe her, but the words wouldn't come out. Her throat was seized by injustice. Just as the nurse began to drag her more forcefully, a faint, almost inaudible sound came from the room where they had taken Arthur. "Lee! Na!" The voice was a hoarse whisper, but to Lena it sounded like thunder. She stopped struggling instantly, her head snapping toward the double doors. The nurse also paused. Surprised. The doctor emerged from the room, his previously annoyed expression now tinged with confusion. "He's calling for someone, a girl named Lena." The older nurse released Lena's arm as if she'd received a shock. All eyes in the hallway turned to the small figure in the faded dress and tear-streaked face. The prejudice in their gazes wavered, replaced by an uncomfortable uncertainty. Lena didn't wait for an invitation. Seizing the moment of hesitation, she pulled free and darted toward the door, past the surprised doctor. The room was bright and filled with rhythmically beeping equipment. Arthur lay on a high bed, wires and tubes connected to his arms. A younger doctor stood beside him, examining a monitor. Arthur's eyes were half open, pupils dilated, but focused on her. "Lena," he whispered again, a little stronger this time, one of his hands weakly lifted from the bed. She rushed to his side. Ignoring the gazes of the healthcare professionals, she grabbed his hand, which was cold as ice. "I'm here, Arthur, I'm here." The relief on his face was so profound it ached in Lena's heart. A small smile touched his pale lips. You saved me," he murmured, the words almost lost in the beeping of the machines. Then his eyes closed again, and his hand went limp in hers. The younger doctor quickly approached, checking his vitals. "He's stable for now, but he's lost consciousness again." He looked at Lena, and for the first time she saw a glimmer of respect in his eyes. The older nurse and the first doctor entered the room, their postures visibly altered. The arrogant certainty had vanished, replaced by an embarrassed caution. "So, you're Lena," the doctor said, clearing his throat. "It seems you were telling the truth." The belated confirmation brought no relief, only a deep weariness. She had expended all her energy, physical and emotional. She simply nodded, still holding Arthur's hand. "We need to contact his family," the nurse said, now with a softer tone. "Does he have any ID? A phone in his backpack?" The backpack. Lena had left Arthur's expensive backpack lying on the sidewalk near the bus stop. Another mistake, another thing they could use against her. His backpack. "It's on the street," she admitted in a low voice, bracing for a reprimand. But to her surprise, the doctor merely sighed. "All right, we'll send someone to look for it. In the meantime, you need to give us your information. Name, address, your parents' phone number." The mention of her parents brought the fear back. "Am I going to be in trouble?" she asked, her voice that of a child again. The doctor hesitated, exchanging another look with the nurse. He saw the pure exhaustion and genuine fear on the girl's face. The bravery that had led her to carry a boy heavier than herself for blocks was undeniable. The truth of the situation was finally settling in. This wasn't a criminal, it was a hero. "No, sweetheart," he said, and his voice, for the first time, held a touch of kindness. "You won't be in trouble. In fact, I think you just saved this boy's life." The kindness, after so much suspicion, was what broke her. A sob escaped her lips, and the weariness of 5 weeks, of a lifetime of feeling small, hit her all at once, leaving her swaying beside the bed of the friend she barely knew, but for whom she had risked everything. A week passed, turning that Tuesday afternoon into a distant, feverish memory. For Lena, life had returned to an uncomfortable normalcy. She walked home from school, looked at the bus stop across the street, and saw it eerily empty. The conversations with Arthur, which had begun to color her days, were replaced by a heavy silence. No one from the hospital contacted her. There were no more questions, no thanks. It was as if the event that had consumed every fiber of her being had never happened for the rest of the world. Her mom, Helena, had hugged her tightly when she arrived home that night, brought by a sympathetic police officer who explained the situation in simple terms. Helena's relief was quickly replaced by deep concern. a familiar wrinkle deepening between her brows. She knew the world and its cruelties, and the mixing of a poor daughter with the son of an obviously wealthy family was a recipe for complications. That night, as she braided Lena's hair, she whispered, "You did the right thing, my love. Always do the right thing, but be careful. The world isn't always fair to people like us." Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Lena felt a quiet pride in her bravery, but also a sting of resentment. She had saved Arthur's life, but all she'd received in return were looks of disdain and a return to her unchanged life. She wondered if he was okay, if he remembered her. The doubt gnawed at her, fueling her insecurity. Perhaps, for people like him, a friend like her was easily forgotten. The following Wednesday, exactly 1 week after the incident, the precarious tranquility of their street was shattered. Lena was on the front porch, helping her mom fold laundry when the first car appeared. It was a black sedan, so gleaming it reflected the clouds, moving slowly down the potholed street like a swan on a muddy pond. It stopped directly in front of their small, modest house, with paint peeling around the windows. Soon after, 3 other identical cars pulled up, forming an imposing fleet that drew curious neighbors to their windows. Lena's heart started to pound. Helena dropped a half-folded towel, her face pale with apprehension. The door of the first car opened, and a tall man stepped out. He wore a dark grey suit that looked like it cost more than a year's rent for their house. His hair was black with silver at the temples, and his face, though tired, held an authority that seemed to emanate from him, changing the entire atmosphere of the street. He looked at their house, the hand-painted number beside the door, and then his eyes landed on Lena. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her take a step back, seeking the protection of her mother's skirt. The man walked toward them, his expensive leather shoes making a soft, decisive sound on the cracked cement path. 2 other men, similarly dressed, exited the other cars and remained at a respectful distance, observing everything with professional vigilance. The man stopped in front of the small iron gate. "Mrs. Lena?" he asked, his voice deep and calm, yet imbued with unquestionable power. Helena, regaining her composure, stepped forward, placing herself protectively in front of Lena. "Yes, I'm Helena. Who are you, sir?" The man offered a small smile, a gesture that didn't reach his tired eyes. "My name is Richard Sterling. I'm Arthur's father." The revelation dropped like a stone into the tense silence. Lena held her breath. So, this was the boy's father. A man whose presence was so grand, it made their small house seem like a toy. This was the owner of the world of expensive uniforms and shiny cars. Richard Sterling, a name she didn't know, but one that sounded like money, like power, like the kind of person who could build an empire with a phone call. He was a billionaire whose fortune was legendary in business circles, with a net worth built on astute investments in stocks and technology. He looked at Lena, and the intensity in his gaze softened, replaced by something she couldn't decipher. Emotion. Gratitude. I came to thank you, Lena," he said, his voice slightly choked. "The hospital told me what you did. They said you saved my son's life." Suddenly, Lena's world, which had returned to its normal size, expanded and tilted in a dizzying, frightening way, and she knew with a chilling certainty that nothing would ever be the same. Richard Sterling gestured to one of his assistants, who promptly stepped forward with 2 items in his arms. The first was a bouquet of flowers so large and luxuriant that Lena could barely see the man behind it. There were white lilies, pink roses, and other exotic blooms she'd never seen before, all tied with a silk ribbon. The sweet, overwhelming perfume filled the air, a stark contrast to the smell of earth and clean laundry in their yard. The assistant handed the flowers to Helena, who accepted them with trembling hands, her face a mix of astonishment and distrust. She looked at the arrangement, likely calculating that it cost as much as a month's groceries. The second item was a thick, white envelope, which Richard himself took and extended to Lena. "This is for you," he said, his voice still soft. "It's a small token of my gratitude." Lena looked at the envelope, then at her mum. Helena gave an almost imperceptible nod. With hesitant fingers, Lena took the envelope. It was heavy and made of fine, textured paper. She opened it carefully. Inside, there was a plastic card with a major grocery store's logo and a folded piece of paper. On the paper, it read, "Gift card, $1,000, $1,000. The amount was so abstract, so monumental, that Lena's mind couldn't process it. It was more money than she'd ever seen in her entire life. It was groceries for months. It was new shoes without holes in the soles. It was fixing the leaky roof. It was a security her family rarely knew. She looked at Richard, her eyes wide, unsure what to say. The words, "thank you," seemed small and inadequate. Helena, seeing the amount over her daughter's shoulder, gasped. "Mr. Sterling, this is too much. We can't accept it." Richard gently raised a hand. "Please, it's nothing. What your daughter did for my son is priceless. No amount in dollars or any other currency can repay it. She was brave and selfless. She didn't hesitate. She saved my only child, the most important person in my life. Consider this the least I can do." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. The facade of the imposing businessman had cracked, revealing a terrified and immensely grateful father. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes telling the story of a week of vigil and fear. Helena, a woman rarely speechless, struggled to find a response. She looked at her daughter, whose instinctive act of kindness had brought this man and his immense wealth to their humble doorstep. Pride swelled in her chest, so strong it almost hurt. "Thank you," she finally managed to say, her voice choked. "Lena just did what her heart told her." Richard nodded, his eyes fixed on Lena. "And she has a heart of gold," he said. "Arthur is recovering. He asks about you every day. The doctors found he has a rare condition, something that makes him prone to sudden episodes. If you hadn't acted so fast." He didn't finish the sentence, emotion engulfing him. He took a deep breath, composing himself. "I wish I could stay longer, but I need to return to the hospital. As soon as Arthur is better, I'd like both of you to visit him. He would be very happy to see you, Lena." The idea of going to the hospital again, of entering that sterile, judging world, sent a shiver through Lena. But the thought of seeing Arthur, of knowing he was okay, overcame the fear. She nodded, a small smile finally appearing on her lips. Richard smiled back, a genuine smile this time. "One of my assistants will be in touch to arrange the details," he said, turning to leave. "Thank you again." He got into the car, and the black fleet departed as silently as it had arrived, leaving behind a fragrant bouquet of flowers, a gift card that would change their lives, and an overwhelming sense that the line separating their two worlds had been irrevocably erased. Helena hugged Lena tightly, burying her face in her daughter's hair, the scent of the expensive flowers mixing with the familiar smell of her little hero. But as Lena held the plastic card in her hand, a new and unsettling worry began to form in her mind. What would happen now? The days that followed were surreal. The gift card, initially viewed with a mix of euphoria and suspicion, became an undeniable blessing. For the first time in a long while, Helena went to the grocery store without a calculator in hand, filling the cart with fresh fruits, yogurts, and even a small packet of imported cookies Lena always eyed longingly. The refrigerator, once half empty, was overflowing, the pantry full. That piece of plastic represented more than food. It represented relief, a brief period of respite from the constant financial anxiety that hung over their house like a rain cloud. Helena, however, remained cautious. She used the card sparingly, as if she feared the magic might end at any moment. "This is for emergencies," she'd repeat, even as she placed a steak in the pan, a rare luxury that filled the house with a delicious aroma. Meanwhile, at her job, something had shifted. Helena worked as a night shift cleaner in one of the massive downtown office buildings. It was an anonymous, grueling, but stable job. She was good at what she did, efficient, reliable, and invisible, exactly how her employers liked her. The week after Richard Sterling's visit, his assistant called, as promised, to schedule the hospital visit. The voice on the other end of the line was polite and professional. During the conversation, he mentioned the name of the company he worked for, Sterling Holdings, the flagship company of Richard's vast empire. The name rang a bell in Helena's head. It was the same name emblazoned on the badges and floor mats of the building where she spent her nights scrubbing floors. Her blood ran cold. She was an employee of Richard Sterling, one of thousands, of course, an insignificant cog in his colossal money-making machine. But still, an employee. She had never made the connection. To her, the building owner was a faceless figure, a distant corporate entity. Now, that figure had a name, a face, and a debt of gratitude to her daughter. A chilling panic seized her. Should she tell him? Should she pretend she didn't know? The coincidence was so unlikely it felt dangerous. What would he think? That she was trying to take advantage of the situation? That her daughter had befriended Arthur on purpose? Paranoia, fueled by a lifetime of disadvantage, began to bloom. She decided, for now, to keep the information to herself. It was safer. The hospital visit was scheduled for Saturday. Lena was nervous but excited. She chose her best dress, one her grandmother had given her, and Helena carefully braided her hair. When the black car, the same one that had come to their house, pulled up to the gate, Lena felt as if she was stepping into a fairy tale. This time, at the hospital, the reception was drastically different. The nurse at the counter, the same one who had treated her with such disdain, flashed a wide, forced smile at the sight of them. "Mrs. Helena, Lena, Mr. Sterling is waiting for you. This way, please." They were led down quiet corridors to a wing that looked nothing like the chaotic emergency room. It was the private wing. The rooms were suites, with wooden doors and soft carpets. Richard met them in the hallway, the relief on his face visible. "Thank you for coming," he said, guiding them into the room. Arthur was sitting up in bed, dressed in blue silk pajamas. He looked thinner and paler, but his eyes lit up at the sight of Lena. "Lena!" he exclaimed, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Lena rushed to the bedside. "Are you okay?" "I'm better now that you're here," he said, and the simplicity of his joy warmed her heart. They began talking as if nothing had happened, as if they were shouting to each other across the street. They talked about Lena's teacher, Arthur's neighbor's dog, and a new video game he'd gotten. For a few minutes, they were just two children, two friends, and the barriers of wealth and social class dissolved. Helena and Richard watched from a distance, a bittersweet smile on both their faces. They saw the purity of that friendship, a connection that the adult world, with its complications and prejudices, had not yet tainted. But in the corridors of Sterling Holdings, the story of the cleaner whose daughter saved the boss's son began to spread. Poisonous whispers followed Helena as she pushed her cleaning cart. Looks of envy and resentment accompanied her. Executives who used to walk past her without notice now observed her with a new and dangerous interest. They didn't see a proud mother, they saw an opportunist. And one of them, an ambitious and resentful manager, saw an opportunity to undermine the boss's image and perhaps gain some power in the process. The friendship between Lena and Arthur flourished in that sterile hospital room, an oasis of innocence amid an increasingly complicated world. Richard found, seeing the genuine happiness in his son's eyes whenever Lena was near, encouraged the visits. Almost every afternoon, a car was sent to pick Lena up from school and take her to the hospital. They spent hours playing board games, drawing, and telling stories. For Arthur, Lena's presence was the best medicine, more effective than any drug the doctors could prescribe. For Lena, those visits were an escape from a reality that was becoming increasingly hostile. At school, news of her connection to the rich kid had spread like wildfire. The children, who used to be her friends, now looked at her with a mix of envy and scorn. "Here comes the princess," a classmate hissed as she passed in the schoolyard. "Thinks she's better than us now." Another boy shoved her, making her drop her books. "You're trying to milk his family, aren't you? My mom says people like you only care about money." The words were like stones, each leaving a bruise on her already fragile self-esteem. She tried to ignore them, tried to remind herself that they didn't know the truth, but the bullying was relentless. She began to isolate herself, spending recesses alone in a corner of the library, finding refuge in the silent worlds of books. The joy of her afternoons with Arthur was the only thing keeping her afloat, but even that joy came with a price. She felt split between two worlds, belonging to neither. At home, the tension was of a different kind. Helena noticed the emotional bruises on her daughter, the way she would shrink and become quiet. But Lena refused to talk about school. Meanwhile, at work, the atmosphere for Helena had become glacial. Her cleaning colleagues avoided her, and supervisors watched her with hawk-like eyes, searching for the slightest mistake. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, and the ground was a long way down. The turning point came on a Thursday night, 2 weeks after Richard's first visit. Helena arrived for her shift and found a white envelope in her locker. It wasn't from Richard Sterling. It was a thick, official-looking corporate envelope. Her heart pounding, she opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, a termination letter. The words were cold and corporate. "Departmental restructuring, elimination of your position, services no longer required, effective immediately." There was no explanation, no prior warning, just an abrupt and brutal end to the job that supported her family. The shock left her breathless. She read the letter again and again, the words blurring before her tear-filled eyes. Restructuring, but she was the only one on her team being let go. She had always been an exemplary employee. It made no sense, unless it had nothing to do with her work. It had to do with Lena, with Arthur, with Richard Sterling. Someone in a position of power wanted her out. Someone was punishing her for getting too close to the sun. She staggered out of the building, the crumpled termination letter in her hand. The financial security the gift card had provided suddenly seemed fragile and temporary. It was gratitude money, not a salary. It wasn't sustainable. The fear, the true and profound fear of poverty, which she had kept at bay for so long, returned with full force. How would she pay next month's rent? How would she buy food when the card ran out? Despair enveloped her, cold and suffocating like a wet blanket. She walked home in a daze, the weight of the world on her shoulders. Opening the door, she found Lena asleep on the couch, a book open on her chest. Her daughter's face, so serene in sleep, was a painful reminder of what was at stake. Lena's courage had saved a life, but instead of reward, the world had given them bullying, isolation, and now, unemployment. The promise of a fairy tale had turned into a nightmare. Helena sank into a chair, the silence of the night broken only by her silent sobs, and wondered how, in God's name, she would tell her daughter that the friendship that brought her so much joy had cost their family's livelihood. Helena didn't tell Lena about the termination. Not immediately. She couldn't bear the thought of extinguishing the only ray of sunshine in her daughter's life, of burdening her already small shoulders with adult guilt and fear. So she pretended, every night. At the same time, she'd put on her work uniform, give Lena a goodnight kiss, and leave the house. Instead of heading to the glass and steel skyscraper, she would walk to a park a few blocks away and sit on a cold bench under the dim light of a street lamp, the crumpled envelope in her pocket, a constant reminder of her failure. There, she'd spend hours in the dark, trembling with cold and anxiety, replaying her limited options. Look for another cleaning job. Her former employer's reference would now be a stain on her record. Take on odd jobs, not reliable enough to pay the rent. Richard Sterling's generosity, which had once seemed like a godsend, now felt like a curse in disguise, a bait that had led them into a cruel trap. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Helena, the truth about her termination was more sinister than she imagined. It hadn't been a random corporate decision. It had been orchestrated by Marcus Thorne, an ambitious and envious director of operations. Marcus oversaw the General Services Department and deeply resented the attention Richard Sterling, a man he idolized and feared, was giving to a mere cleaner. He saw Helena's connection to the boss as a dangerous anomaly, a breach in the rigid hierarchy he so valued. When whispers about the cleaner's family grew louder, he saw his chance. Using the excuse of a minor protocol infraction he himself fabricated, Helena supposedly leaving a supply closet unlocked, he terminated her, framing the decision as a necessary security measure. He knew that Richard Sterling, preoccupied with his son's health and managing a global business empire, would never get involved in a trivial matter like the dismissal of a low-level employee. It was the perfect crime, discreet, efficient, and satisfying his distorted sense of order. Lena, oblivious to these dramas, continued to visit Arthur, whose health visibly improved. He was finally discharged from the hospital, but doctors insisted he avoid stress and maintain a calm routine. For Arthur, calm had a name. Lena, Richard, grateful and relieved, hired private tutors for his son and insisted that Lena continue to be his study and play companion in the afternoons. A car would pick her up from home, no longer from school, to avoid peer attention, and take her to the Sterling estate, a place that made the hospital seem modest. The house was a modern palace of glass and white stone, overlooking the ocean. There was an infinity pool, a home cinema, and a garden so vast it resembled a park. Lena felt as though she had stepped onto another planet. At first, she was intimidated by the opulence, by the wealth that manifested in every detail, from the artwork on the walls to the silver cutlery. But Arthur was the same old Arthur. He didn't care about the expensive furniture. He wanted to build pillow forts and run around on the lawn. With him, Lena could forget the bullying, forget the pitying looks from neighbors, and just be a kid. However, the shadow of her mother's termination hung over her, even if she didn't know what it was. She noticed the worry in Helena's eyes, the way her mum smiled less often, the weariness that seemed to have settled into her bones. She noticed that the food in the pantry was starting to dwindle again, and the luxuries had disappeared. "Mom, are you okay? You look tired," Lena asked one night as Helena tucked her into bed. Helena forced a smile, adjusting the blanket around her daughter. "I'm fine, my love. Just a lot of work." The lie tasted bitter in her mouth. She was caught in a web of deception, trying to shield her daughter from the harsh reality, but feeling that with each passing day, the web tightened, slowly suffocating them. She looked at Lena's sleeping face and felt a wave of protective fury. Someone had taken her job, destabilized her life because of her daughter's act of kindness, and she didn't know who her enemy was, nor how to fight him. Arthur's transition back to a school routine, even with tutors at home, brought a new and formidable obstacle. The board of the elite private school, Northwood Academy, was informed of the circumstances of his absence and the unusual nature of his friendship with Lena. The news spread like wildfire among the parent-teacher board, a group largely composed of wealthy and influential families who saw the school not just as an educational institution, but as a fortress to protect their social status. They didn't see Lena and Arthur's story as an inspiring tale of courage and friendship. They saw it as a dangerous incursion. A girl from a poorer neighborhood, now with direct and continuous access to one of the community's richest families, was a threat to their exclusive bubble. What if other children of that kind tried to do the same? What if their children were negatively influenced? The fear, disguised as concern, was palpable. Led by a woman named Veronica Thompson, whose family had built its fortune over generations of investments and whose greatest fear was the dilution of her social prestige, the parents initiated a silent but fierce campaign. Veronica, an elegant woman with a steely smile, requested an urgent meeting with the school board and Richard Sterling. In the academy's mahogany-paneled boardroom, she presented her case with surgical precision. "Richard, we all admire what this girl did for Arthur," she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "It was a heroic act. However, we need to consider the long-term implications for the safety and well-being of our children." She spoke about cultural differences, the risk of dangerous situations, and the importance of maintaining the integrity of the school environment. The subtext was clear and ugly. Lena didn't belong there. Other parents voiced their support, sharing veiled anecdotes about petty thefts in nearby neighborhoods and the importance of children associating with their own kind. The pressure on the board was immense. They relied on the generous donations of these families to maintain the school's standard of excellence. Richard, still emotionally drained by his son's illness and focused on restructuring his businesses, was caught off guard by the intensity of the opposition. He tried to argue, speaking of values and gratitude, but his words fell on deaf ears. The board's decision was a devastating blow. Arthur would be welcomed back to school, but with a strict condition. His friendship with Lena should be limited to the home environment. She would not be permitted on the school campus, nor at school events, and interaction between the two should be supervised to prevent any inappropriate influence. Essentially, they were forbidding a friendship, erecting a bureaucratic wall between two children. Richard left the meeting furious and powerless. He was a billionaire, a man accustomed to moving mountains with his will, but he was being cornered by the pettiness and class prejudice of his peers. Arthur's health was still fragile, and the doctors had been clear. Any emotional stress could trigger another episode. Separating Arthur from Lena abruptly was a risk he could not take. But the pressure from the school community was relentless. He felt trapped, forced to navigate a social minefield that threatened his son's well-being. News of the school's decision reached Lena indirectly. She noticed a shift in how Richard's drivers treated her, the conversations that ceased when she entered the car, the tension in the air whenever the word school was mentioned. Arthur, sensing his father's reluctance to discuss the matter, became anxious and withdrawn. He didn't understand why he couldn't bring Lena to meet his other friends or show her his favorite playground at school. The prohibition, though unspoken, began to poison the atmosphere, creating a crack in the friendship that had seemed, until then, unbreakable. And Lena, seeing the anguish on her friend's face, began to blame herself. Maybe the bullies at her school were right. Maybe she didn't belong in his world. Perhaps by trying to help, she was only causing more problems. The weight on Lena's shoulders became unbearable. On one side, relentless bullying at school isolated her, turning the hallways and playground into hostile territory. On the other, the silent pressure from Arthur's world made her feel like an intruder, a blemish on his perfect life. And, at home, her mother's veiled anxiety was a constant reminder that something was terribly wrong. Helena still maintained the charade of going to work every night, but the tension in her face was unmistakable. Lena, with the sharp intuition of a child who had learned to read between the lines of survival, knew that her mother's termination and her friendship with Arthur were connected. Guilt gnawed at her from within, a slow, painful acid. She was the cause of her mother's suffering. She was the cause of the worry on Richard Sterling's face. She was the cause of the confusion and sadness in her only friend's eyes. The only solution, her 8-year-old mind concluded with painful logic, was to disappear from their lives. If she stepped away, perhaps everything would return to normal. The bullying would stop because she would no longer be the girl who wants to be rich. Her mum might get her job back if the embarrassing connection to the Sterling family was severed, and Arthur would be free to live in his world without the complication she represented. The decision broke her heart. The idea of no longer seeing Arthur's smile, of no longer hearing his laughter, was like imagining a world without sun. But the loyalty that had compelled her to carry him across the street now drove her to a different kind of sacrifice, protecting him from herself. She began to create distance. When the driver came to pick her up, she'd invent excuses. "I'm not feeling well today," she'd say, her voice low and unconvincing. "I have too much homework." At first, Arthur called, his voice full of concern. "Are you okay, Lena? I miss you." Each of his words was a knife to her chest. "I'm fine," she'd lie, blinking back tears. "We'll talk later." After the third consecutive refusal, the calls stopped. The silence that followed was louder and more painful than any shout. She felt hollow inside, as if she had ripped out a part of herself. But it was for their own good, she repeated to herself, a weak mantra against the growing pain. The effect on Arthur was immediate and catastrophic. Lena's absence created a vacuum in his routine, a hole that no amount of toys or paternal attention could fill. He became apathetic, refusing to eat and losing interest in his games and tutors. The light in his eyes, which had returned with Lena's presence, began to fade again. He had developed a deep emotional reliance on his rescuer, his only true friend. Her emotional stability was the anchor that kept his fragile health in balance. Without her, he was adrift in a sea of anxiety. Richard watched his son's deterioration with growing panic. He didn't understand Lena's sudden withdrawal. He tried calling Helena, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Helena, afraid of a confrontation about her termination, was avoiding his calls. To Richard, it seemed the entire family was rejecting him after everything he had tried to do. Then, what the doctors feared happened. One afternoon, while looking melancholically out the window, waiting in vain for the car that used to bring Lena, Arthur had another episode. His face went pale, his breathing became shallow, and he collapsed in the arms of a terrified nanny. The rush to the hospital was a repeat of the nightmare, but this time, the cause was no mystery. When Arthur regained consciousness, the first and only word he whispered was Lena. The doctors were direct with Richard. "Mr. Sterling, your son's condition is exacerbated by emotional stress. The separation from this friend seems to have been the trigger. Physically, he can recover, but psychologically, he needs her. His life right now may depend on it." The revelation hit Richard with the force of a train. He, a master of negotiation and strategy, had underestimated the most powerful force of all, the friendship of two children. His attempt to appease the Northwood parents, his hesitation, everything had contributed to putting his son in danger again. He had failed. And to make matters worse, Lena's withdrawal wasn't the only consequence of Veronica Thompson's campaign. Someone, seeing an opportunity to cause more trouble, had made an anonymous report to social services. The report alleged that Lena's family was an unsuitable environment for a child to interact with a boy of superior status, insinuating neglect and negative influence. The investigation was just beginning. The social worker's arrival was silent and unexpected. On a Saturday morning, a tired-looking woman with a rumpled blazer and a stack of files under her arm knocked on Lena's door. Her name was Ms. Davis, and her voice was soft, but her eyes were sharp. Registering every detail of the small but immaculately clean house, the worn furniture, the warped bookshelf, the flowers from Richard's bouquet, now dried and fragile in a vase on the table, Helena, who had opened the door, felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. A social services investigation was every poor, single mother's nightmare. It was a presumption of guilt, a veiled threat that her most precious possession, her daughter, could be taken from her. The anonymous report was a cruel low blow, a weapon used by someone who wanted to hurt them irreparably. Miss Davis was polite, but her questions were like small probes, searching for weaknesses. "What is your financial situation, Miss Helena? Does Lena have adequate meals? How would you describe her friendship with the Sterling family?" Helena answered everything with trembling dignity, fear and anger battling in her chest. Lena watched from the kitchen doorway, her heart beating like a trapped bird. She understood what was happening. The rich parents didn't want her near Arthur, and now they were trying to prove she was a danger, that her home, her only refuge, wasn't good enough. It was prejudice in its most official and terrifying form. The interview left a trail of poison in the air, a sense of violation and powerlessness. They were being judged by their poverty, their lives scrutinized under a hostile microscope. Meanwhile, the story, previously confined to whispers in school and corporate corridors, exploded in the local media. An online tabloid, sniffing out the scent of scandal, published a sensationalist article, "The Millionaire and the Girl from the Wrong Side of the Tracks, Friendship or Exploitation. Sources question poor family's influence over young Sterling heir." The article was a fabric of half-truths and malicious insinuations, painting Lena as a junior social climber and Helena as a manipulative mother. Photos, taken from a distance, showed Lena entering Richard's luxury cars, the images distorted to appear like secret transactions rather than gestures of friendship. The scandal turned their lives into a public hell. Neighbors, who had previously treated them with cordial indifference, now looked at them with suspicion. Parents at Lena's school forbade their children from speaking to her, as if her poverty were contagious. Lena could no longer walk down the street without feeling the stares and hearing the whispers. Their home, once a sanctuary, became a prison. Helena, unemployed and now under investigation, began to crumble. The facade of strength she had maintained for so long began to crack, revealing the desperation underneath. Richard Sterling, upon seeing the article, felt a cold, calculating fury he hadn't felt in years. He recognized the language, the subtle insinuations. It was the hallmark of Veronica Thompson and her circle. They weren't just trying to protect their bubble. They were actively trying to destroy an innocent child and her mother to prove a point. His son's health was at risk, and now the family of the girl who saved him was being publicly crucified. The last straw was the social services investigation, which he learned about through his lawyers. It was an unacceptable escalation. He had tried to be diplomatic, tried to navigate the sensibilities of his social class. No more. They had crossed a line, and he would retaliate with the full weight of his power and his fortune. His first call was to the hospital, to the medical team caring for Arthur. He wanted all reports, all blood samples, all test results from day one. A terrible suspicion, a thought he had dismissed as a father's paranoia, began to take shape in his mind. Arthur's condition was rare, yes, but his relapses seemed conveniently timed with stress events. What if it wasn't just stress? What if there was something more? Something everyone had missed? While his medical assistants gathered the data, he prepared for war. He hired the city's best public relations firm to combat the tabloid narrative and the best team of lawyers to deal with the school and the social services investigation. The capital cost was astronomical, but irrelevant. His focus was no longer on profit or stock dividends. It was on justice. He looked at his son, sleeping restlessly in his hospital bed, and made a silent promise. He would find the truth, no matter how ugly it was, and he would protect the two children the world seemed determined to destroy. The truth, when it arrived, was uglier and more terrifying than Richard could ever have imagined. It came in the form of a detailed toxicology report, requested by a rare disease specialist he had hired in Zurich, paying a fortune to expedite the results. The specialist analyzed weeks of Arthur's blood samples and found minuscule, almost undetectable traces of a compound derived from a rare plant. The substance, when administered in small, continuous doses, didn't kill immediately. Instead, it mimicked the symptoms of a neurological disorder, causing weakness, disorientation, and eventually organ failure. It was a subtle, diabolical poison designed to kill slowly, making death appear to be the result of a tragic, natural medical condition. Arthur didn't have a rare disease. He was being systematically poisoned. The report landed on Richard's desk like a death sentence. The air fled his lungs. The whole world tilted and shattered into a million pieces. Someone close to his son, someone with daily access to him, was trying to murder him. The list of suspects was small and terrifying. The poison was being administered through the vitamin supplements Arthur took every morning, mixed into his orange juice. Only a handful of people had access to those supplements. Richard, the longtime housekeeper, the nanny, and his own brother, Frederick, Arthur's beloved uncle, Richard's younger brother, who lived in the guest wing of the mansion. Frederick, who managed a small part of the family business with thinly veiled resentment for always being in the shadow of his billionaire brother. The inheritance, the vast fortune. If Richard died, Arthur would be the sole heir. But if Arthur, a sickly child, died first, the fortune would pass to the closest relative, Frederick. The memory of dozens of small incidents flooded Richard's mind. Frederick insisting on preparing Arthur's juice, the exaggerated concern that always seemed a bit performative, the subtle comments about the boy's fragile health. Everything clicked with horrifying clarity. The revelation was the third and most devastating twist. It was no longer about class prejudice or bullying. It was an attempted murder, and the only person who, by sheer chance, had interrupted the process was Lena. By taking Arthur to the hospital that first afternoon, she hadn't just saved him from a crisis, she had removed him from the environment where he was being poisoned, giving his body time to partially cleanse itself, confusing the doctors and, unknowingly, saving his life. And her withdrawal, which caused Arthur's relapse, put him back under Frederick's direct care, allowing the poisoning to restart. Richard's blood ran cold. He had, inadvertently, placed his son back in the hands of his would-be killer. He acted with the speed and precision that made him a legend in the business world. He didn't call the police immediately. Frederick was cunning. He would deny everything, and the evidence was circumstantial. Richard needed a confession, and he needed to protect Lena, the only witness who could, unknowingly, unravel everything. He understood, with painful clarity, why the universe had placed that courageous girl in his path. She was the key. He drove to Lena's house, this time without the fleet of cars, in a discreet vehicle. He found Helena and Lena huddled at home, afraid to go out. He sat in their small kitchen. The contrast between the humility of the surroundings and the monstrosity of the truth he carried was stark. He explained everything about the orchestrated termination of Helena's employment by Marcus Thorne, which he had uncovered through an internal investigation, about the defamation campaign led by Veronica Thompson. And finally, his voice choked, about the poisoning and his suspicion regarding Frederick. Helena and Lena listened in shocked silence, their world turning upside down once again. "I need your help," Richard said, looking directly at Lena. "Frederick doesn't know that I know. He thinks Arthur's relapse was because of your distance. The only way to catch him is to make him feel safe, make him try again. But this time, we'll be watching. I need you to come back to my house, Lena. I need you to pretend to be Arthur's friend again. But now, it's the most dangerous mission you can imagine. You'll have to be near a man who might try to hurt him, and perhaps you." He was asking an 8-year-old girl to be bait in a trap for a potential murderer. The choice he placed before her was the most terrifying of all. to bear witness, risking her own safety and her mother's, or to remain silent, leaving her friend in mortal danger. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the hum of the old refrigerator. Helena looked at her daughter, her heart a knot of protective terror. The idea of putting Lena in any kind of danger was unthinkable. She opened her mouth to refuse, to scream that this was madness, that Richard Sterling and his monstrous problems should stay far away from her family. But before she could speak, Lena lifted her head. Her eyes, which had reflected so much fear and confusion in recent weeks, now shone with fierce determination, the same that had propelled her to carry Arthur across the street. She didn't fully grasp the complexity of evil, the greed for an inheritance or family betrayal, but she understood one thing with crystal clarity. Arthur was in danger, and she could help. "I'll do it," she said, her voice small but unwavering. "I'll protect Arthur." The girl's simple, direct courage silenced any objection. Helena looked at her daughter and saw not a victim, but a warrior. In that moment, she knew she couldn't stop her. Instead, she needed to trust her. Richard's plan was meticulous. Tiny cameras and microphones were installed throughout the mansion, especially in the kitchen and Arthur's room. A new security team, composed of former federal agents, replaced the old staff, moving through the house disguised as groundskeepers and drivers. Lena and Helena were moved into the guest wing, the same one Frederick occupied, under the pretense of protecting them from media harassment. Proximity was essential for the trap. Lena resumed her routine with Arthur, who, oblivious to everything, was radiant to see her. His recovery was almost instantaneous. Her presence was, indeed, his best medicine. For Lena, however, every moment was tense. She played with Arthur under the watchful eye of Frederick, whose friendly smile now seemed the mask of a monster. He was charming and attentive, always offering snacks and juices, and every gesture carried an invisible threat. Lena followed Richard's instructions to the letter, politely declining anything Frederick offered and ensuring Arthur also didn't accept. Richard's first victory came quickly. With proof of Helena's wrongful termination in hand, he called an emergency meeting with the board of Sterling Holdings. He didn't just fire Marcus Thorne, he publicly exposed him in front of his peers, detailing the pettiness and cruelty of his actions. He then announced a new corporate program, a multi-million-dollar emergency fund for low-income employees, and a complete overhaul of HR policies to protect the most vulnerable workers. The measure shocked the board, but the message was clear. Loyalty and humanity would, from that day forward, be more valuable assets in his company than blind ambition. The corruption had been exposed, and the price to fix it was an investment in his own people. The second victory was against the school. Richard called another meeting, but this time he didn't come alone. He brought his lawyers, a copy of the tabloid article, and evidence linking the anonymous sources directly to Veronica Thompson. He didn't threaten to withdraw his funding. He did something far more powerful. He offered a massive donation, the largest in the school's history, to create a scholarship program for children from underserved neighborhoods, named the Lena and Arthur Courage Fund. The condition was that the school implement a mandatory curriculum on empathy and class prejudice. Cornered and publicly shamed, the board and Veronica had no choice but to accept. The bullying wasn't just stopped, it was transformed into a lesson for the entire community. The tension in the mansion, however, reached its peak. Frederick, sensing his window of opportunity closing with Arthur's rapid recovery, became careless. One afternoon, believing he was alone, he went to the kitchen to prepare Arthur's supplement. The cameras recorded everything, him opening a small capsule, mixing a white powder into the orange juice, and carefully wiping away any traces. It was the irrefutable proof Richard needed. When Frederick brought the glass to the room, Richard and his security team intercepted him. Frederick's denial crumbled before the video footage. The mask of the loving uncle fell, revealing a face contorted with greed and hatred. The arrest was silent and swift, far from the children's eyes. Later that night, Richard sat with Arthur and, in the gentlest way he could, explained a version of the truth, focusing on the illness and recovery, omitting his uncle's betrayal for now. The boy was safe, finally safe. Next, Richard went to the room where Lena and Helena were. He didn't need to say anything. The look of relief on his face said it all. Helena cried, tears of pure relief and gratitude. Lena simply watched the man who, in a few short weeks, had transformed from an intimidating stranger into an ally, a protector. He had used his immense wealth and power not to intimidate, but to seek justice and protect the defenseless. The main conflicts, the webs of lies and prejudices, had been resolved, not with violence, but with truth and courage. 5 weeks after that sunny afternoon, the world had transformed. The Sterling estate, once a symbol of intimidating wealth, became a second home. The garden, once a perfectly manicured lawn, now had a tire swing hanging from a leafy tree, installed by Richard at Lena's request. Helena was no longer an anonymous cleaner or an unemployed mother under investigation. Richard, recognizing her strength and integrity, offered her the position of administrator for the company's new charity fund, a role where her compassion and life experience would be her greatest assets. She would have a dignified salary, security, and, most importantly, the opportunity to help other families like hers. The change was dizzying, but Helena embraced it with the same quiet grace with which she had faced adversity. She and Lena moved into a comfortable house in a safe neighborhood near the mansion, a gift from Richard that Helena only accepted on the condition that it be considered an advance on her new salary. She insisted on maintaining her independence, a trait Richard deeply admired. The friendship between Lena and Arthur became the foundation upon which two families, once separated by a social chasm, built a new reality. They were no longer defined by their bank balances or zip codes, but by the bonds of loyalty and affection they had forged in fire. Lena, enrolled at Northwood thanks to the new scholarship fund bearing her name, discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. She still felt insecure at times, a fish out of water amidst such opulence, but the constant look of admiration from her best friend reminded her of her own worth. She learned that her voice, even if small, had the power to inspire monumental change. Arthur, free from the poison in his body and his environment, flourished. He discovered that the truest friendships don't come with price tags, and that true strength doesn't lie in wealth, but in the capacity to trust and love. His uncle's betrayal left a scar, one that would take time to heal, but the unwavering love of his father and Lena's loyalty were the balm he needed. Richard Sterling underwent the most profound transformation of all. The ruthless businessman who measured success in profits and stock market quotes rediscovered the humanity he had almost lost in his pursuit of more. Nearly losing his son not to an illness, but to human greed, was a brutal awakening. He saw that a man's true net worth wasn't in his assets, but in the lives he touched. He restructured his businesses, prioritizing employee well-being and social impact over quarterly dividends. He sold shares, diversified his investments into ethical funds, and discovered that the profitability of an act of kindness surpassed any compound interest. He realized that the greatest fortune he could leave his son wasn't a business empire, but a legacy of compassion. On a warm Sunday afternoon, exactly 5 weeks after it all began, the two families were gathered in the mansion's garden. Helena and Richard chatted in wicker chairs, not as boss and employee, but as friends, sharing stories and laughter. Lena and Arthur ran barefoot on the grass, chasing butterflies, their laughter echoing in the air. Lena paused for a moment, breathless, and looked at the scene. The setting sun painted the sky with shades of orange and pink. She looked at her mom, whose face was relaxed and happy in a way she hadn't seen in years. She looked at Richard, who watched his son with a pure, unguarded love. And she looked at Arthur, her friend, who smiled at her, waiting for her to run again. In that instant, she understood. The journey had been terrifying, filled with obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But every step, every tear, every moment of fear had led her to this place. A simple act of helping a friend on the sidewalk had unleashed a chain of events that not only saved a life, but healed wounds, tore down walls, and united worlds. Courage, she realized, was like a seed. Even the smallest one, planted with a gesture of selfless compassion, could grow and transform into something beautiful and unshakable.